Well, hey, welcome back to Mission Focused Life. Awesome to have you joining us. I'm Pastor Tanner here in Rock Island, Illinois. Joining with me is Tim Oloffson, the executive director of Another Child Foundation down there in Tennessee. And with us is a special guest, Pastor Nathan Hurst, a good friend of mine over in Davenport, the pastor of Grace Family Church, an amazing church over there on that side of the river. So I want to say thank you guys, and it's good to have you with us today.
It's good to be here.
Yeah. And I've been looking forward to this episode. I know we've been trying to get Pastor Nathan on for a couple episodes here now, and I'm just excited. I always love listening to you guys talk. You always bring interesting debates, highly intellectual debates. You guys might deny that, but it is. And I'm always just intrigued by what you guys have to say. And today we're going to tackle a different subject that we haven't even thought about or talked about in the past. So Tanner, if you want to introduce today's podcast subject, then go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're going to talk about Israel. Why it's a good idea for maybe the United States to have an ongoing relationship with Israel, but definitely what does it mean for us as Christians to have an appropriate and healthy relationship, a God-honoring relationship with the nation and the people of Israel. And I can't think of anybody better than this to talk to about than with Pastor Nathan. Pastor Nathan is the head of the local Night to Honor Israel. It's a yearly event that celebrates the people of Israel, celebrates those relationships, and it's done an amazing job of raising funds to help people and to get back to living in Israel, the Jewish people. So, Pastor Nathan, let's get this started off with a really easy question. As Christians, what is our correct relationship with the nation and the people of Israel?
Well, first of all, I would say we could go through biblical history, but I would probably point to Romans because everyone loves the New Testament, especially evangelicals. They love to pull from the New Testament first, even though that's not where our faith starts. But Romans 15:27 says, for if the Gentiles have shared in their, meaning the Jews, spiritual things, they are indebted to minister to them, the Jews, also in material things. We forget that we have a rich spiritual history, that the lineage of those of us that are evangelicals flows right through Israel, the Jewish people. And again, in Romans, we have this admonishment from Paul to literally think of our spiritual heritage. So it happened that early. So the early church is already formed. Romans is kicking off. The writers of Romans kicking off, and this is in first century church. And they're literally saying at that point in time, "Don't forget your heritage." Now we could say that's because Paul was a Jew and he had, kind of a partiality to Jewish people. Yet we know later on he teaches us not to have that partiality. So we are indebted to that idea that we should have a strong moral connection, and we should have a strong physical connection to the people of Israel and to the Jewish people, because that's where our heritage comes from.
Awesome. Well, I know some of the confusion comes in theologically because they're developed this idea of replacement theology over time. Can you speak a little bit to that and about what the Bible teaches about what our relationship to the Jewish people is today?
So there's a difference between what I would call replacement theology and fulfillment theology. So we don't replace anything as the church or as New Testament believers. We don't replace what God did through the Jewish people. We don't replace what God did through the covenant that he cut between himself and the Jewish people. However, there's a fulfillment that we do see in Romans that points to the temple being in us and the Holy Spirit being the dwelling, or the indwelling of the Holy Spirit being a representation of the temple being in us. There are some things that are fulfilled in New Testament theology that we see set up in ancient Israel and the Jewish people. We see the Messiah obviously fulfilled in Jesus, where your common everyday Jewish person might not see that same that the picture brought out the same way. But any good serving Jewish person, when Jesus comes back and the Messiah comes, they will have a very poignant question to ask: is this your first or second time? And if it is, if they believe that Jesus is the one after that second coming, that kind of would share with them the idea that, Christianity is what it says it is. And so there is that divide amongst the Christians and the Jews. But for those of us that are concerned, I think we can't take what God set up as principled covenant through the Old Testament, through the Jewish people, and then replace that with the church. Now, it doesn't mean that those things aren't fulfilled in the church, but we can't replace that. And that's where you see some churches go, so they don't have to deal with the Israel thing. They don't want to deal with the conversations around Israel, so they just kind of push it off and say, well, no, God means that that's the church now, and we don't have to deal with the people of Israel. We don't have to deal with the nation of Israel or the Jewish people. And that's just bad theology.
Well, thank you for speaking to that and explaining that a little bit better. So
hopefully that was a succinct.
It was fantastic. So one of the things that we notice, and this extends even in the world today, but you go through history, and the Jewish people have never really been popular. They've always kind of been cast as the bad guys. And even in society today, I mean, we rarely hear a positive thing. I know that they are supposed to be allies of ours here in the United States, but it seems like, depending on which administration we have, recognizes them in that form. So why do you think it is that the Jewish people have received such a bad rap, and especially in recent years have gotten the negative press that they have?
So there's two things there. There's probably three. There's the ancient history that we see in the Middle East, that we try to devise, who owned what land for the longest period of time. There's going to be some contention on that, depending on who you look at and what authors you read, what podcasts you view, what news articles you look at. Realistically, I don't think there's a lot of question that Abraham, you can see ties all the way back to there, and that there is some division of what becomes the just generic Arab population as opposed to the Jewish population. We can argue that forever. We know that there's ancient ties to both people groups. The other issue there is one of politics. Geopolitics, who controls what landmass and what region, and what that has to do for different peoples and groups. Sorry, there's a fly flying around me. And then the other is spiritual. So what is the spiritual motivations, I would say, of a given people group, and I would say of an ideology, and particularly maybe something more sinister in a spiritual context, the idea of angelic or demonic spirits and things like that being having an interest in this holy land, because we know it's marked as the most holy place on earth, specifically Jerusalem. And so there is going to be some fighting if you believe it's holy, if you believe there's a spiritual narrative at all. There's going to be some fighting for that land and its populace. And so I think there's kind of three different compartmental ideas as to why there's tension. And then those play out on many different levels. You have historians arguing with each other and history teachers arguing with each other about the history of the land. Then you have individuals arguing about the geopolitics of the land. Who should own what? Who should have what resources? Is it right for Israel, like today, to be building on what is contentious land? Should we be fighting the spiritual battle that's obviously over that area? And what does that look like? So there's three different compartments in which we have this conversation. None of them have soft and easy answers. I would encourage anyone listening, do your research, know what you believe and why, and then engage yourself in what that looks like. So if you come up with an ideal on whatever the topic would be, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's the history of the land, or whether it's something more spiritual, then engage yourself and see what that fleshes out, because it will likely lead you to form not just a theology about the Middle East, but a theology about God himself. So if we see God reveal himself in a certain way through history, through geopolitics over the years, and then ultimately spiritually, that will tend to shape your image and view of who God is. So it's not a simple thing to answer, but at the same sense, it's something that we takes a lot of time and study. Again, probably not the most definitive answer, but as bland as I can give without getting too much in the weeds and causing too more questions.
Sure. Tim, what about you? What are some thoughts that you have on this topic?
Well, sometimes I kind of get confused. I don't know a lot about Israel, the land, and the Jewish people. So I guess what is a simple way to define the difference between the Jewish state and the state of Israel? Is there a separation? Is there a difference between Israel and Jewish people?
So not now, right? So right now, no, there's not a big difference. Israel is morphing as its government is set up the way it is, that it's more and more inclusive as time goes on. Depending on who you read, they'll say it's an apartheid state. That's ridiculous. You literally have Arabs participating in the government, and they're making up part of the government now, and there are contended factions as part of the loose government that they have now. It's been 3 years since they've had multiple elections to elect a prime minister. Netanyahu was ousted recently, and the gentleman who took over, they have kind of a segmented government in the way it works, and it's actually built by minorities now, minority groups of people. So it's very inclusive. The government's very inclusive, but on the other hand, it is the destination or homeland of the Jewish people. So it's hard to take away the government from the actual landmass and people group. Now, in the United States, we have we have an easier time separating, because everything that happens in the Middle East is far off from us. We do the same thing with Muslim and Sunni and Shia. We don't understand. Those are two factions that fight each other all the time, constantly. They're at war more with each other than they are with us. The Sunni Shia would rather kill themselves than kill Americans. Yet you don't have that understanding on the news. Well, there's similar ideas when it comes to the people of Israel, the Jewish people, and the nation state of Israel. So one of those would be there are Jewish people scattered all throughout the world. So when disbursement happened because of different reasons throughout history, people fleeing Germany and German oppression and the Holocaust, people fleeing at different points in history when the nation itself was broken up, those people, in one sense or another, want to come home. So right now, our organization is putting together funds to bring Ethiopian Jews back to Jerusalem, back to Israel. It's called Aliyah. They're making this trip, and it's a way of helping these people come back to what they believe is their land, their rightful land, coming back to the rightful home. Now, some have been gone for many generations, so they've intermarried and intermingled with different cultures and groups, and they look a little different than maybe they did when they left. That's okay. There's no barrier to entry because they look different. So you have, Ethiopian Jews, very black Jews coming to Jerusalem. They don't look like a Middle Eastern man or woman. But again, at their heart of their core, they're still Jewish because they carry that tradition. And so they're coming back home. So that might give a loose definition of what it is, that there are people groups throughout the world that some of them are wanting to come back to the nation state of Israel. And then there's the nation state of Israel itself trying to preserve not only a landmass, but trying to preserve a way of life. One of the things that's different for Christians, that Jewish people see the world differently, and it's kind of divided up there too, but they are called or separated because of their worship to God, to Yahweh. And so they're called to be something different than the rest of the world. That's what marked them initially in the Old Testament, and that carries that marking through and even into the nation itself, that it is called, or it's carved out, or it's marked as a testament to God. So hopefully that helps.
Well, I think sometimes some of that confusion comes in too, that there can be a pretty stark divide between what we would consider to be a religious Jewish person and a secular Jewish person. Somebody that is purely Jewish based off of ancestry, and then somebody that's actually practicing the Jewish faith. And I think many times, especially here in the United States, I would say the majority of the Jewish people that I have met personally are Jewish in ethnicity or ancestry only. They're not necessarily practicing a faith. They're not going to synagogue. They're not practicing the law, and they're more interested in the traditions and keeping that culture alive for their family.
Yeah, I mean, just like Christianity, right? There are some folks who come on Christmas and Easter only.
Yeah.
And realistically, if God had said to Christians post the resurrection, here's a landmass that I'm telling you is yours, we would fight tooth and nail to get it.
Yeah.
Every one of us would. And we would have people from all over the world, whether they're converts or not, coming to that landmass. And so that's kind of what happened with the Jewish people. God not only rescues them, if you know your Bible, you know that God, cuts off a segment of the populace and says, I'm going to carve you out, you're going to be mine. And then when he does that, he gives them a way of living, or the Torah, the way of being. And then he cuts out a landmass and says, not only are you going to mark yourself different by the way you're going to worship me and live, and it's going to be a common union thing, that you're also going to have a landmass which you call your own. Now, again, there are some other religions that do that. Islam is one, but in Islam, they don't teach that you have to live there too. Where lots of the Jewish teachings, through the rabbinical teachings, teach that to be a really good Jew, you have to live there too. And so, and that's all up in definitions and everything else. But if Christians had that, trust me, we kind of did that with the Crusades. We kind of went, England's it. And, we tried to convert everybody and then bring everybody back. It didn't work out too well. Mostly because it wasn't sovereign. What we see happening with the Jewish people is a sovereign act of God. He said, this is your land. Now, we could argue all day as to what that landmass looked like. What did Abraham see? I don't know. I just know God cut covenant with him. And at that point, they're always going to then fight for that landmass.
And it's so interesting too. I mean, Nathan, you and I got to go there together a few years ago, and it's not a big piece of property. I mean, it's something that you can cross in a couple of hours, and yet for 2,000 plus years, it's been at the center of controversy. And it's so interesting that it just keeps showing back up. For 1,900 years, they weren't even a sovereign and recognized nation by themselves. And then in 1948, they came back onto the scene again, and now it's recognized as a country. And for the last 73 years, there's been fighting about whether or not even that should exist. And so it's just
and that's going to happen forever. I mean, the fighting, there have been portions in history where Jews and Arabs got along. Most of that was because the land mass wasn't as contended. So now, because there's like hardened borders and it's a very contended area, you're going to have some fighting. I think there's going to be some compromises over time. Hopefully there will be some very good peace agreements. And we saw the Abraham Accords last year with some Arab states recognizing Israel, having some transactionary dealings with Israel. So that's all good news. But then there's the other side, like the Hamas side, that in their charter wants to wipe out not just Israel, but every Jew on the planet. So there's a difference in some Arab countries coming to a rationale that we can live peaceably and it's good to have commerce with one another. And, we'll do what we can to develop a relationship. And then there's the other side that still has it in their charter as an organization. We're going to wipe out not just the nation state, but all Jewish people. Yeah. And by the way, just so you know what side the United States should be on, in that same charter, Israel's the big Satan. The United States is the little Satan. So after they get done demolishing Israel and the Jewish people, they want to come after us and the Western way of living. So for us in geopolitical issues, we should probably side with the people that want to be our friends and not give aid to the enemy. We haven't always done that. One of the stupid things that we did as a country when the Holocaust was going on, we wouldn't stand up to Hitler and we wouldn't stand up to the Germans and just say, this is wrong. This is, you're killing people. This is genocide. You can't do this. It's kind of like what we're doing with China right now and the Uyghurs, whereas as a country, we're not saying this is genocide. Nancy Pelosi did say it was genocide recently. And then she said, but we've got better things to work for with China, including climate change. So we're going to kind of overlook that. It's just one of the stupidest statements I've ever heard from someone. Genocide should be enough for us to implore heavy sanctions and everything else, but that's a different conversation. But I think that's the problem with a lot of folks and how they view the Jewish people is they don't understand that we have a common enemy, and that common enemy, while we have a common history, we also have a common enemy, and that common enemy will wipe us out the moment they get an opportunity. And I mean the Western world. They will eradicate it from the globe if they can. And depending on which side it is, there'll be an advancement of some type of Islamic state law that will be imposed on everyone.
So let me ask you this question real quick. So are they after the Western culture, or is it the Christianity that's kind of the underneath of all of that? Is it Christianity, or is it?
So I would say yeah. That's a hard question because it depends on who you talk to, but mostly it's culture. They don't want what they believe is an infectious culture to come into Islam. Okay, so what we're seeing right now in Afghanistan is a good example. Regardless of how you feel the withdrawal went, now you have it taken over by terrorist sympathetic groups. So ISIS, is going to flourish. Other groups are going to flourish. They will cut off communication, so they will cut off the internet. The only information we'll get out of that country will be what is state sanctioned. And in the future, it's going to look really, really bad. So our influence now is going to be totally washed out. So as soon as that country was flipped, we saw little girls being told they can't go to school anymore, and worse things happen, obviously. But that is a model of what the world would look like given the opportunity. And I'm not saying that that's a negative towards all Muslims or towards Islam in general. This is a very localized, specific group, but they still want to do everything they can to kill Israel, to kill the Jewish people, and to totally wipe off Western civilization. Now, there's a spiritual component to it as well. I believe that there's always this antichrist, or what is the antithesis of God, of Jesus, and there's that antithesis spirit in the antichrist, and you see that in this faction of Islam and some other factions, and they are going to do what they can to wipe Israel out, wipe us out. I would be looking towards Iran as a facilitator of that, as they're facilitating all of this action on Gaza, just bombs and different types of munitions coming over and directed at civilians and directed at schools and hospitals. Last year, our organization raised money to build a bomb shelter in the bottom of a hospital, children's hospital, so that when there are bombings or when there are issues, that they could keep all of the patients safe and alive, because they're obviously there because they need help in a bomb shelter. Now, we in the United States don't think about that. We don't think about living in a space where at any moment you could hear air raid sirens and you'd have to transfer all the patients, critically ill patients, to patients with a hangnail, down to a bomb shelter just to keep them safe. Yeah, the world's totally different there. Not that it isn't safe. When we were there, I felt like I was in one of the safest places in the world. But at the same time, you have to deal with things that we don't deal with.
I know one of the questions that I've seen come up again and again from people is the question of what it means to be chosen. It's something that people talk about when they talk about the Jewish people, that they are God's chosen people. And sure. I think sometimes there's a little bit of a misunderstanding of exactly what that term means. Do you want to speak to that a little bit? What does it mean for the Jews to be God's chosen people?
Mm-hmm. So, obviously scripturally, we can see that they're, the apple of God's eye. This is the type of language that we see used about the people group. We can go Genesis 12:3 goes early as that, where, you bless those that bless God's people, you're blessed. You curse those that curse God's people, you're cursed. Out of this group will all nations of the world be blessed. You could take that language to the furthest extent. Chosen, I think, is God chose them to initiate his plan for humanity. And through that people group came who we know as Jesus. That doesn't mean they're not chosen now, because God has to deal with them based on his covenant. So his covenant, while it was ratified in Jesus, doesn't necessarily change. So if you could keep all 660 whatever laws that they have, that's going to be between you and God, or whether or not he'll give you salvation. But we also know that in the New Testament, that law was given so that we might see how frail we really are and that we can't keep it. and that we need a savior or a Messiah. And so from our perspective of an evangelical, one of the reasons that we do what we do is not just because of our connection to the Jewish people, and not just because we have a scriptural mandate, as we saw there in Romans, to share with them in the good that we have as Christians, but also to hopefully see the Jewish people saved. They're looking for a Messiah. We know who he is.
Yeah.
And again, we don't go out and proselytize Jewish people maybe the same way we would anyone else, because there still is that differentiating factor that they are still God's people. Now, does that mean they can do no wrong? No, the Israeli government does what it does. And sometimes I agree personally, sometimes I don't. There's geopolitical stuff there that, we could talk about all day. But that doesn't mean the people are perfect. That means God is sovereignly still has his hand on them. What does that mean in full context? You'd have to ask God. Like I can't answer for him. But I know when he cuts covenant, he doesn't change it. So he doesn't negate a covenant that he spoke to the Israelite people. But on the other hand, he did ratify it with Jesus. And so there's a space in there that I think we could argue about what that means. Now, I would go back to a New Testament concept, particularly post-Romans, and say that, we have now, we understand the full nature of the covenant that God cut with humanity, and that we share in that, and that we're participants in that as evangelical Christians. Now, some of my Jewish brothers and sisters might not like that. That's okay. That's where our differences of opinion might lie. So do I believe God's people are chosen? Yes. What were they chosen for? Well, they were chosen for the purpose of Jesus coming, this lineage that we are going to see of the Messiah. Post the Messiah, what are they chosen for? Well, they're still chosen as a demonstration of God's people, separate in covenant through their worship, and that this is what God's people can look like when they come to worship together under the laws of God. So God set out rules and ritual, and that is a testament to teach the world what it looks like to be separate. The Jewish people have terms for this: the Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba, meaning the age present and the age to come, and that there are many things that we do in the present age that is supposed to point us to the age to come. So whatever is in heaven, we're trying to find a physical representation of. We were told in the New Testament, or the Old Testament, not to mix fibers. That was somehow wrong, and it was against God's law. Well, that wasn't because God cared about fibers being mixed. It's because he was trying to explain his holiness and how pure it is, and he wanted a representation of that physically on the earth. And so he gave them something of the Olam Hazeh and the Olam Haba, meaning something in the life to come, here now, in the present age. And we see that a lot, talked about a lot in rabbinical teaching. And it's something that evangelicals should be more aware of, because it does show us that we're chosen. We, even as evangelicals, we're chosen to be part of God's family. But what are we chosen for? Well, we're chosen for separation. We're chosen to be called out. We're chosen to represent heaven on earth. And that's still the job of the Jewish people.
That's great. Hey, I got one more question for us before we wrap up.
Sure.
So, Nathan, as a leader in our community who's doing a great job in helping to bring awareness and also celebrate the nation and people of Israel, what can we do? As normal Christians living our normal lives, how can we do a better job of linking arms with the Jewish people and celebrating them and recognizing that connection that we do have?
Yeah, I'd say the first thing is get to know the Jewish community in your area. So, that's pretty easy. If you find someone in a synagogue, in a Jewish center somewhere, get to know some of those folks, because we have a lot of shared interests and a lot of commonalities. The second is be aware of geopolitics and what is real and what isn't. There are some things that are going on that we see in the news that are totally fabricated about Israel and the Jewish people and the nation state of Israel and what's going on regarding that contended landmass. Just know what's real and what isn't. I think that's one of the biggest issues as far as Christians not wanting to step into that realm, is because they don't know. They don't know any better. Follow some of the information that the IDF puts out, the Israel Defense Force, because they'll be pretty plain about some of the things that they're doing, either in protection or offensive measures. Now, I will say this. They're a military like every other military on the planet. Sometimes they go too far. Sometimes they use too much force. That does happen. I'm not here to minimize that. And they don't always own up to it, just like we don't always own up to it in the United States. We had a drone strike recently that was supposed to kill terrorists, and it kills 11 people, and one of them is an aid worker. I mean, we didn't own up to that. We had to find that out through the French. So, military is usually not the best source of information, but at least it will help you get a perspective as to a different side of the story that you won't see from like CNN or whatever. And then the third is to pray, pray about how God might have you involved, because the Jewish people and the Jewish state are important for our history. They're important for our future. So what would God teach you and tell you about the Jewish people that would level up your faith life? So once you understand the customs, and once you understand what God did through the Jewish people and what he's doing now through that little country, it gives us a higher understanding of the Father, and it gives us a higher understanding of what Jesus actually did for us, being the Messiah, what that means. Because there are still people today waiting the Messiah's return, and they're keeping all of this religious pomp and circumstance so that they can be ready when the Messiah comes. And most Christians have a hard time, sitting through 3 songs and a 3-point sermon. So maybe with a little bit of study, we would have a better understanding of the commitment that other folks are making or have made in generations past. And it gives us maybe a better understanding of where our faith comes from and how deep-seated it really is, because it's not a superficial thing.
Yeah. Nathan, is there one person, whether you follow on Twitter or on social media or podcast, that you would refer people to kind of learn more about that?
Probably not one person. I would say, well, I'll give you two examples. There's a real quick kind of reference program called The Watchman that's hosted by Eric Stakelback. You could look at that on YouTube and Facebook and whatever. And then if you want to be active in any of this politically, specifically, there's CUFI, Christians United for Israel, which is the largest evangelical group to partner with Israel and with the Jewish people that we have in the United States. So CUFI is a great place to start. They have tons and tons of resources. You can get the book, Why Israel? You can get other information sent to your home for free. They're obviously going to ask you to donate like all these groups do, but it's a good resource. So between the Watchman, Eric Stakelback's program, and CUFI, that's a good jumping off point. And then there are so many other resources post those 2 introductory points that you could connect with.
Yeah, I think it's tremendously important for us as Christians. It's our responsibility to understand some of these topics that you've touched on, and to understand it more deeply, because it does affect who we are and how we live our lives. And so I just want to thank you for sharing some of your insights and your expertise on this. And
absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you. Tanner?
Yeah, absolutely. Pastor Nathan and Tim, guys, it was awesome to be on here with you as always. Yeah. I've been around Nathan for several years now, and I'm still learning stuff from him today. So thank you so much for sharing all that. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us. As always, we want to encourage you to share this on Facebook so other people can see it and be blessed. And until next week, we hope that you guys have an awesome rest of your week. God bless you.